Good afternoon, everyone. Uri, come on.
I'll send you.
So I am Ahmed Igbaria. I am a teaching fellow in the Schusterman Center and Middle Eastern Studies here at UT. I teach most of my people here are my students. I teach the Arab-Israeli conflict. I teach the history of Israel, as well as, in general, the Middle East. Today, I invited an old friend of mine. First time I met Danny Orbach was at Tel Aviv University in 2003. It was really difficult time in 2003 when just 2 years before the second Intifada started in 2001. And I came to know Danny through our conversation about what's going on and how can we imagine the future. Danny, after a few years, he finished his first book when he was a master's student. This is an incredible achievement. And he went to Harvard, and I came to UT Austin, and then 20 years after, we are back again. Please welcome with me Danny. He will speak to us for 40 minutes. And the last 20 minutes, we will open the floor for Q&A, okay? Okay, Danny.
Okay.
That's Danny there?
Do I need to hold the mic?
No need.
Okay. Thank you, Ahmed, for this very generous introduction. And thank you all for coming. It's always nice to see such a packed full room. So today we are going to speak about Operation Mole and the Kafr Qasim Massacre, from deception to mass murder, and I have to give credit where credit is due. This is a work done in collaboration with my co-author, Dr. Yagil Henkin from the IDF Command and Staff College, and we published an article together on it, which would appear in a few days, actually, in the Journal of Military History. And I said the Journal of Military History. First of all, I want to kind of give something on my perspective. I'm a military historian. I'm not a historian of Israel-Palestine. So my point of view will be more understanding how a massacre happens in certain historical circumstances and in comparative perspective. And I'm much less interested in making a statement on Israel-Palestine or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm personally Israeli, but this could have been a study on a Japanese massacre, which I also do. So I work comparatively from a perspective of military history. So what are going to be the important points we are going to speak about today? First of all, the facts. We are going to learn about the massacre, what happened in the Israeli-Palestinian town of Kafr Qasim on the 29th of October 1956. We will speak about a mysterious military operation which was somehow related to the massacre, called Operation Mole, which is secret to this day, and we'll speak about the different versions and controversies of how Operation Mole is related to the massacre. And then we'll go to theory. I'll try to give you a model of how to understand the massacre, and then we'll apply it on Kafr Qasim and see how this massacre is connected with another very important military term called strategic deception. And then we'll see how Operation Mole was actually related to the massacre, and we'll try to make sense to understand the massacre and to see how it happened. It's also important to say that this study is based on new documents that we recently discovered in the archives of the Israeli police. So this is really brand new. In October 29th, 1956, it was the first day of the Suez crisis, or the Kadesh War, or the Sinai War, which you may have learned in classes of Middle Eastern history. It was a war between Israel, France, and Britain on one side, and Egypt on the other side. Jordan was an enemy of Israel as well, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, but it did not participate in the war. Kafr Qasim was an Israeli-Palestinian or Israeli-Arab town right on the Israeli-Jordanian border. On the first day of the war, the local Israeli brigade commander, Colonel Shadmi, which we'll speak more about soon, gave an order to put a very strict curfew on all Israeli Arabs in the region, including Kafr Qasim, and the curfew was pushed up from the usual curfew at 10 p.m. The Israeli Arabs were under military administration, so there was a curfew anyway, but it was pushed up. And the local people didn't know because they worked in the fields. And Colonel Shadmi gave an order to shoot everyone who breaks the curfew. In most villages in the area, the local commanders either changed the order, especially one commander who probably prevented the second massacre, or somehow shot in the air or found other ways to evade the order. But in Kafr Qasim, the local commander, Lieutenant Dahan, carried the order verbatim and massacred in cold blood 48 people, men, women, children, old people, pregnant women. In that day, actually, almost all the victims were killed within 40 minutes, in between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. of October 29th. After the massacre, the perpetrators were put under military tribunal. They were put on trial. And they said, we just followed orders. Actually, there were two military tribunals, which you can see here. That was the tribunal of the rank and file perpetrators. It's called the trial of the 11. Here you see the 11 main defendants. These are the soldiers. Lieutenant Dahan was the commander of the massacre on the ground, and the battalion commander, Major Malinki, who passed Shadmi's order to the troops. There was a separate trial of Colonel Shadmi, which you can see here. These were like two court-martials. The first court-martials gave a relatively heavy punishments. The soldiers and officers involved said they just obeyed orders. They are not responsible. That's just the orders they received. And the court very famously said that certain orders you must disobey. If you receive, and this is the most famous quote from the Kafr Qasim ruling, a manifestly illegal order, meaning if the order you have to refuse, is an order with a black flag flying over it, shouting in one's face it's forbidden, not illegality hidden or half hidden, nor illegality manifest only to the eyes of legal experts, but illegality that stabs the eye and revolts the heart, lest the eye be blind and the heart stony and corrupt. I said that punishments were relatively heavy, but most of them were pardoned relatively afterwards and set few years, 1 year, 2 years, usually less. The original sentences were heavy, but they were changed later. The second trial of Colonel Shadmi, he was acquitted from responsibility to the massacre, and he was only convicted in putting a curfew without orders in an unauthorized way, and he was fined in 1 penny, only 1 shilling. That's also very famous. Now we are going to leave the events for a while and go to theory. And this is an interpretive model we developed in our comparative study for making sense of massacres which are not formal state policy. This is very important because a massacre, if it's formal state policy, then it's very, very clear, you know. That's government policy. The government gives an order and the order is being carried out. Nothing to interpret or to understand. But massacres which are not government policy are usually more complicated because they are based on a certain interpretation of ambiguous orders. Remember that the orders in Kafr Qasim were given all across the sectors, but carried out only in Kafr Qasim. That's usually an indicator that what we call an informal massacre was taking place. And let me go a bit into theory. I'll try to make it kind of as simple as possible. Think about yourself when you are interpreting something, unrelated to military affair, unrelated to war crimes. You read a novel, and the first sentence in the novel is Lucy entered the house and closed the door behind her. If you know it's a horror story, or if you know it's a romantic comedy, you'll interpret the sentence in a very different way, right? Then you read more and more sentences, and your opinion on the whole starts to change, on the whole book. Maybe it's both a horror story and a romantic comedy. Maybe it's something else. Then when your expectations of the whole are changing, you understand that sentences you read differently, which is again changing your interpretation of the whole. This is called by Hans-Georg Gadamer and other hermeneutical theorists the hermeneutical circle. You go from the whole to the parts and back to the whole, and it's very, very important what is your fore projection. What is fore projection? What you expect from the book, let's say, in the first place. In wars, it matters a lot how the soldiers see the war, just like what we said about the whole of the book, a horror story or a romantic comedy. Is this war about having quick victories and show the world how great we are? Or is this war about taking vengeance on an ethnic group, for example? Soldiers will treat civilians very differently according to this framing of the war. And sometimes the war is also reframed. We'll see how it happened in Kafr Qasim, which may again influence the way the soldiers view civilians. And fore projections are also very important. What the soldiers know from past wars. And remember, we are speaking on the Middle East, Israel, Palestine. What was the past war, which was the closest to 56? The War of 1948. And this played a very big role in the imagination and in the framing of the war by officers and soldiers. And then, when you receive an ambiguous order, and I'll give you examples of all sorts of ambiguous orders. All the examples are from real cases, by the way. You see a bunch of civilians or POWs, and your commander tells you, you know what to do with them. And he leaves. My Lai, Vietnam. My Lai massacre. The commander may give a contradictory order. Shoot, don't be afraid, shoot. It will be justified killings, but don't commit any murders. Kafr Qasim. We'll see that that's what happened in Kafr Qasim. Or telling you, kick these bastards out of here. What does it exactly mean? The framing of the war and your fore projections matter a lot in the way you'll interpret the orders. Or at least it will make certain interpretations more likely. There are also what I call peaks and valleys. It matters a lot when the soldiers encounter the civilians. There are certain moments which are more dangerous than others. The heat of battle is always a very dangerous moment. Mop-up operations, when you are looking for partisans or resistance fighters, is also a very, very dangerous moment for civilians. There are moments which are less dangerous. Speak about it in passing because it's less relevant to Kafr Qasim. And also, when we said everything, individual decisions of commanders and soldiers matter. And we saw in Kafr Qasim that some carried out the order and some didn't. Now, let's go to the Kafr Qasim massacre itself and the way it was interpreted by different people at the time and later. The Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, wrote in his diary after the massacre that the massacre was due to Shadmi's negligence, the brigade commander who gave the order, Malinki's stupidity, Malinki is the battalion commander more down the line, and the sadism of Dahan and Ofer, the soldiers and officers who carried out the massacre on the ground. And this developed what I call the traditional Israeli view, or the establishment Israeli view, that the massacre was an aberrant crime, an unusual event of soldiers who carried out manifestly illegal orders. Now, very gradually, an alternative view developed. And the alternative view had a very strong connection with a mysterious military operation known as Operation Mall. When I say mall, I don't mean like a shopping mall, I mean like the animal. And the first hint to Operation Mall, it's just like a detective story, it was kept strictly secret, is a journalist who told one of the modern historians of the massacre he didn't want to speak about Operation Mall. And he told him, he was dying, this journalist at the time. The historian interviewed him on his deathbed. He said, look for this animal, look for this animal, and you'll find the truth about the massacre. And everybody argued what was actually Operation Mall. And gradually, critical historians, especially from the Israeli left and Palestinian historians, came to the opinion or the theory that Operation Mall was a secret plan to expel all Arabs who lived near the Jordanian border, the region we call the Little Triangle, to Jordan. And the massacre was done by soldiers who believed they were kind of part of the operation. And the operation was canceled at the last moment, and then the government used the soldiers as scapegoats, because they saw that the Arabs didn't actually escape across the border. The plan failed. So let's put these people on trial and convict them and call it manifestly illegal orders and thus hide the operation. The Mall documents are still classified, and historians tried to kind of know what happened, what was Operation Mall, by all sort of circumstantial evidence. We can speak about it more in the Q&A. The last book on the subject is this book for you Hebrew readers. It was not yet translated to other languages. I think it's being translated to Arabic and English as we speak. The book of Adam Raz, The Kafr Qasim Massacre, A Political Biography. Raz's thesis is very complicated, very sophisticated, but on the whole, he agrees with the alternative view I just presented. That Operation Mall was an operation of expulsion of the Arabs across the border, and the massacre was kind of connected to Operation Mall in the way that the soldiers believed that they were working for the goals of the operation. But Raz did not see the documents of Operation Mall, we did. And the way we found the secret documents of Operation Mall, me and my co-author, is that we looked in the police archives. And the documents were in the police archives all along, just nobody bothered to look. It's not the entire plan, but it's the versions that the soldiers in Kafr Qasim had on the ground. So in our opinion, the most important version. Operation Mall was, and I will speak about in detail what it actually was, it was not an operation of expulsion. But it was connected to the idea of expulsion. I'll explain in a minute. Now I want to just present our view, and then I'll try to prove and kind of compare it to Adam Raz's view. We believe that the massacre was actually connected to strategic deception. Strategic deception is a military move, a strategic move, where you try to deceive your enemy during a war in a very major point. Why? That's why it's strategic and not tactical. Classic strategic deception. Egypt practiced strategic deception on Israel in 1973 when it made all sorts of tricks that the Israelis will not believe that Egypt is going to go to war, where Egypt was actually going to attack. The Germans practiced strategic deception on the Soviets in Operation Barbarossa, again, camouflaging their intention to attack the Soviet Union. In the case of the War of 1956, Israel wanted to mislead, was about to attack Egypt along with England and France. But it wanted to deceive Egypt and make the Egyptians believe that Israel is going to attack Jordan instead. What we argue is that Operation Mall was an unwanted result of his strategic deception. That it was a chain of events tied to the strategic deception, and I'm going to explain it in the rest of the lecture. Now we are going to go into the historical facts, after we presented all the models and the different views. First of all, I want you to see the chain of command. Who are our actors in the historical drama from the Israeli side, the perpetrators? First, we have General Tzur, chief of the Central Command. He is responsible for the entire area between, let's say, Jerusalem and almost the north of the country, a very, very, very big area. On the border with Jordan, we have Colonel Shadmi, whom we already met, who gave the order that ended up with the massacre, the commander of the 17th Infantry Brigade. Below him, Major Malinki of the Border Police, 2nd Battalion Border Guards, and he has two company commanders below him. Captain Frankenthal, who changed the order, and there was no massacre in his sector, and Captain Levi, who did not change the order, and the massacre occurred in his sector. And we have on the ground, the perpetrators on the ground, Lieutenant Dahan, the platoon commander, Shalom Ofer, the squad commander. These are the people who commanded the actual massacre. Let's see the map and see the geography a little bit. Here is Israel, here is Jordan, and the entire infantry brigade in this area, and you see Kafr Qasim, this kind of triangle, this circle, sorry, this black circle in the bottom of the map. The 17th Infantry Brigade is in this area, and the companies which are guarding the border are the companies who belong to the battalion of the border police. What the border police should do normally in the area, if there is a war, they should block the roads, they should prevent infiltration, they should execute counterattacks if the Jordanians attack Israel, they should keep an eye on local Arabs who are suspected of supporting the Jordanians and going over to the enemy, and wait for special orders. Such a special order was indeed given on the day of the massacre, and now you need to remember it was the order to put a curfew, to push the hour of the curfew from 10 p.m. to 5 p.m., and that was the order that resulted in the massacre. These commands of what they should do in routine were called Operation Ktura. But along with Operation Ktura, that everybody knows, it's not a secret, there was one secret command known as Operation Mol. And now it's the time to see what was actually inside the documents that we read. Operation Mol said as follows: in case of a war with Jordan, the border police has to quarantine the Arab villages, meaning to encircle them, to deny haven for infiltrators from across the border, evacuate smaller villages to larger ones, and that was built, and you know from US history, remember what the American administration did with Japanese Americans in the Second World War? Operation Mol was based just on that. Consciously, it's written in the orders, based on the American and Japanese case, to take smaller villages like Kafr Qasim and evacuate them to larger villages like Tira. It's not an expulsion across the border, it's just the opposite. It's expulsion inside the border. But the idea that the operation actually means expulsion across the border was quite widespread among the troops and the units involved. We'll see in a moment how. But what is crucial is that Operation Mol was a ruse. It was a false contingency. It was never about to happen. It shouldn't have happened. It was part of the strategic deception. And I'll explain how. Israel was about to fight Egypt. You know, Egypt is in the south. But it wanted to fool the Egyptians that it's about to fight Jordan. In order to do that, the Israeli High Command released all sorts of orders, plans, contingencies, which were all directed against Jordan. In a war with Jordan, you are doing X, Y, Z. And Operation Mol was one of his orders which were built as part of the deception. How did we prove it? Because in the documents of Mol it is written what equipment and what resources the unit should receive in order to evacuate these people inland. they received none of his resources and equipment. Operation Mole was in fact a ruse, but very few people knew it. Only a very small number of people in the high command. Almost everybody involved in Operation Mole believe that it is real and about to be implemented, including the people who wrote the operation. So what happened is a phenomenon that we see sometimes in military operations that we call the unintentional consequences of strategic deception. When you plan false contingencies like Operation Mole, you can fool your own troops, not only the enemy. Because in order to fool the enemy, you have to fool your own soldiers as well. And there is no quality control. If you plan operations that should actually happen, there is a lot of quality control because you plan them in great detail. But if you are not about to carry out the operation anyway, why plan meticulously? Why doing quality control? You shouldn't. So you don't think about the results of this operation if it will actually take place. And because there is no quality control, because the orders are ambiguous, there are diverse interpretations across the ranks. And now, in most modern armies, including the IDF, there is a term called mission command. Mission command means that a commander gets a mission and he is responsible on how to carry it out. I don't tell you how to do your job. I'm telling you what you should do. You are responsible to find the means. And in such situations, it creates wild interpretations because the commanders responsible for Operation Mole, who don't know the operation is a ruse, are starting to think, okay, how we should evacuate these Arabs and in what ways, and start to actually build plans in order to do it. And now what happened with Operation Mole, specifically that it reframed the war. Remember our model of reframing. Instead of a conventional war against Egypt, it became a war against Jordan with the local Arabs as potential traitors in the eyes of the soldiers. So it reframed the whole idea of soldier-civilian encounters. Now let's see what happened with Operation Mole. Again, originally it was a deception plan. The person who drafted the operation, again, believed the operation was real. No one of the people involved knew it's part of the deception. General Tamir, Colonel Tamir, believed that the operation is evacuation into Israel, smaller villages to larger villages. Again, his example was the Americans and the Japanese. But he said, as a kind of a side note, we don't really want these Arabs in Israel. If someone wants to escape to Jordan and not, let them escape. I don't care. But he said it as a kind of a side note. When the order came down, the side note became increasingly important. Remember, lower commanders participated in the war of 1948. As you studied maybe in your Middle Eastern history class, in 1948, Jewish forces expelled many Arabs, expelled Arab villages. So what officers are thinking? Oh, this is just like 1948. What we did in 1948. And one level down, the military governor of the Arab villages near the border, Colonel Marat, is saying the following. It's very hard to translate, even in Hebrew, it's a very cumbersome passage. We'll evacuate them into Israel, and if they want to escape across the border, we will not force them to escape, we will not encourage them to escape, but we will also not encourage them not to escape. It's very kind of self-contradictory and cumbersome. Down the line, the battalion commander of the border guards, Major Malinki, says, you know what? Maybe we should also encourage escape across the border if we can. And officers below Malinki had a much more violent version. Maybe we should kill some people to make the others escape. And what we can see when we follow the documentary trail, how the order gets radicalized when it's moving down the line. And it's actually not even in the original order. It's a kind of an oral interpretation, which is going among officers. Now we reach the day of the massacre, like the most crucial day, what we call in our article, a minute to midnight. One day before the massacre, in the 28th, 1 a.m., General Tzur, chief of the Central Command, is calling Colonel Shadmi, commander of the 17th Brigade, and tells him, Mall is cancelled. Arabs will not be evacuated. Why is telling that Mall is cancelled? That was the plan to begin with. Remember, Mall was part of a deception. It should never have happened. But then Shadmi calls Malinki, and Malinki tells him, the battalion commander, I have a problem. You cancel Mall, but I don't have any other plan. I don't know where to put my patrols. I don't know where to put my units. I don't know where to put the roadblocks. What should I do? And then Shadmi tells him, okay, so we'll maintain Mall just without evacuating Arabs. They call it Mall minus minus. Only the technical aspects of Mall will be maintained. But then when the soldiers and the officers hear it, they see it as a wink. You know, Mall is cancelled, but it's actually not cancelled, because we keep the technical components of Mall in place. In 12:30, Shadmi to Malinki maintain Mall without evacuations, but also push the curfew up to 5, shoot all violators without sentiments. And when Malinki asks what about people who don't know about the curfew, Shadmi answers in Arabic, and this is very famous, Allah yarahmo. May God have mercy on their souls, which was very, very clear what it means. A little later, Malinki orders his sub-commanders, shoot all violators, even returnees who don't know about the curfew. And then there is a Q&A. The Q&A is crucial. Officers begin to ask, what about women and children? Malinki said, shoot them just like the men. What about wounded? There will be no wounded. And the Q&A is radicalizing the whole business, because he's closing more lenient interpretations of the orders. In 3 p.m., Shadmi speaks to Malinki and all sub-commanders and say, Mall is cancelled, do not disturb the Arabs, but shoot those who violate the curfew. He actually referred to people who walked in the dark, who were about to walk in the dark in a very isolated area, but nobody understood it at the time. It was really not clear, and people thought that Shadmi actually ordered to shoot everybody. And then the interpretations, the orders are going down. Captain Levi to his troops, kill all violators. It will not be murder, but rather justified killings. Remember the ambiguity, the contradictory ambiguity we speak about, and it keeps ambiguity. The second captain, again, who prevented the massacre, Frankenthal, prevented the second massacre, warned the villagers in advance, actively bring them home from the fields, and if you cannot delay the curfew, delay deadly fire even more, and don't shoot anybody without asking me first. So he did everything he could to neutralize the order without actually saying that the order is cancelled. So now let's just speak about interpretation. How all of the actors we saw here, how each of them interpreted the orders. Shadmi was a very irascible person. He didn't have patience, he didn't have time. He was known as a commander of don't question me style of command. He didn't even care about whether the people of Kafr Qasim knew or did not know about the curfew. He didn't think about it. Their life didn't matter anything to him. He was very busy. And as far as he understood the order, there will be no evacuations. Nobody will be expelled. Remember, General Tzur told him that Mall is cancelled. But if we can teach these Arabs a lesson and maintain order, it's okay that 1, 2, 3 people will be killed. He didn't really think about the results. Malinki, one level below, understood that there will be no evacuations, but he wanted several people to be killed. Kill a few violators, even women and children, and as he said in his trial, intimidate the others so they will understand there is no fooling around when it comes to security. Frankenthal, of course, wanted to enforce the curfew without killing unless there was no other choice. And Levi's officers, Da'an and Ofer, just took the order verbatim in its most extreme interpretation and conducted the massacre. What actually happened, how we kind of know who interpreted what, because we cannot believe what they said in the trial, right? It may be apologetic. This is the map of the massacre. You see, let's see what happened on the ground. This was the entrance to Kafr Qasim. Here was the most bloodthirsty murderer, Corporal Shalom Ofer, who killed most people in the massacre, and he killed most people here. This was a bloodthirsty murderer as well, Goldfeld, that you see here, who provoked people to go out of their homes in order to shoot them. And we know that the higher echelons, kind of how they reacted, because Dahan, the commander of the massacre on the ground, is reporting all the time about the people killed. And it's going like that. He reports to Malinki, one down. Malinki doesn't react. I say, he wanted few people to be killed, so he doesn't care. 2 down, doesn't react. 3 down, doesn't react. And then Dahan says, 15 down. And then we see Malinki in the radio. What did you say? What did you just say? Many down, too difficult to count. And then Malinki starts to panic. Says, stop shooting. What are you doing? Stop shooting. Don't shoot without my permission. And then Tzur calls Shadmi and said, what the hell are you doing? I don't want a war with Jordan. I want the border to be quiet. I told you Mall is cancelled. So everybody begins to panic when the news about the massacre arrives. The result, 48 villagers killed in Kafr Qasim, many more wounded, most killed by Ofer in the outskirts of the village, other killed by other commanders. In the center of the village, as we said, one Sergeant Goldfeld provoked locals to get out of her home and shoot them. Dahan, the lieutenant who commanded the massacre, was very murderous, but not like Ofer. He was very murderous in some instances, but he skipped some children, especially children. He kind of let in without shooting. And Ofer was the most extreme version of a massacre perpetrator, kind of bloodthirstiness, which was uninhibited. What is our conclusion of his case study of the Kafr Qasim massacre? The massacre, as we've seen, was in variance with the wish of the High Command, and yet senior commanders were responsible. Why they were responsible, even though we didn't want a massacre? First of all, wanting 1, 2, 3 people to die is also a crime. That's for Malinki, that's one. But also because of her negligence. Because they did not block murderous interpretations of her ambiguous orders. Malinki actually even radicalized the possible interpretations in the Q&A, because he had opportunity to say, okay, don't shoot women for it, but he didn't. He said, just shoot them like the rest. And in his trial, he actually said, Malinki, but I said them don't commit any murders. What do you want? And the judges said, and I think very wisely, you did more bad than good because you changed the meaning of the term murder. Because murdering for Malinki was shooting people in their homes, but shooting people outside was not. So you made your soldiers criminals. That's from the ruling. In Kafr Qasim, no one followed orders blindly. Don't believe any massacre perpetrator whoever tells you. He just followed orders. Interpretation of the ambiguous orders was key. Mall mattered. Though being a deception, Mall could be interpreted and was interpreted by some as a plan for expulsion of the Arabs across the border and even murder, and its cancellation was too ambiguous to negate this. Why? Because they said the technical aspects of Mall are still in place, Mall minus minus. Again, it reframed the war from a conventional war against Egypt to a war where the local people are involved. Deception plans can go out of control. Here we saw how. And when applying mission command, that is operational freedom and discretion for junior officers, senior commanders must make sure that the orders are not interpreted as a license to commit war crimes. Telling later, I didn't intend, I didn't think about it, doesn't help any one of the victims. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Danny. Thank you for this interesting lecture. Now, I'm going to open it for the stage for questions. If you have comments, also okay, but please make your question very short and very clear. So you don't actually take the whole time. Start with Anna.
So you spoke about how the Kafr Qasim Massacre was designed to be strategic deception. It was not intended.
Mold, not a massacre.
The Operation Mold was
Yeah.
intended to be strategic deception,
Mhm.
and Kafr Qasim was a result of that.
Yeah,
it was an
unintended.
unintentional result
Yeah.
of that. But how do you think the previous, earlier treatment of Palestinians by Israeli soldiers in the 1948 war in the Nakba, with instances like the Yassin massacre, how do you think that played into the mindset of Israeli military when they approached Palestinians, and how do you think that could have led to a logical progression that would result in this atrocity?
It's a very important question. It's just what I called foreprojection in the theoretical part. When you interpret something like an ambiguous orders you receive, you always think what happened in previous similar cases. And even the young soldiers who did not participate in 1948 heard stories about 1948. And I think the idea that, you could understand from Mol that maybe some people will be expelled across the border, though it was never written in the Mol documents. But killing people, it was never part of any possible interpretation of Mol. But if you grew up in 1948 and you heard stories about killings from 1948, you could get this idea as the soldiers got, let's kill some people so the others will run away. That was a modus operandi that, as you know well, happened many times in the war of 1948. So it mattered a lot and was very important. So Ahmed, you choose.
So I have two quick questions. You mentioned earlier in the presentation that what you have in the archives is only the correspondence essentially from the Megav. The Central Zionist archives have the totality of the story.
Central Zionist archives have nothing to do with it because we are not military.
Okay.
We need to go to the IDF archives.
IDF archives.
And there we can see if the military will ever release it, the original Mol orders which were drafted by Colonel Abraham Tamir, which was the original version of the plan. What we have are two versions of Mol, one that was on Malinki's level, on the battalion level, and one on Frankenthal's level.
Okay.
Frankenthal, the captain who did not carry out the massacre. Why we don't have a version of Mol on Levi's company where the massacre took place? We suspect it was burned. We suspect it was burned or destroyed, but we cannot really know.
So from the IDF archive, what new information would you expect to find if that ever got declassified?
Maybe more detail, but I don't think that's something essentially new.
All right. My follow-up question to that would be, I'm sure you're aware after the new historians started doing similar work with archive work, Bibi's government did a process of reclassifying it, using their work almost as a blueprint to go back and reclassify archives. Do you expect with the police archive, the work you're doing, we could see a similar trend under this current government?
If it will happen, it will not be because of the person who are responsible for the police archives who are very, very open about documents, but it may be an order from above. It doesn't have really anything to do with the level of the prime minister. It's an authority in the defense ministry called the Malmav, which all historians hate guts because they always try to classify documents. And they may try to do it, though we have the documents scanned in our computer, so it will be quite foolish. And I can show these documents to everybody who's interested.
Taylor?
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the key elements in the chain of events you seem to describe is a disparity in perception of what Mol was between lower level officers and it on the strategic level. In the, that kind of broken telephone, as it's named on the slides, at what point does it become more down to, carrying out whatever individual people are doing as opposed to the broader strategic element? At what point are people having to, or links in the chain having to interpret the orders in broader ways because they're so vague?
only when they are dealing with the civilians, which in this case is enforcing the curfew, which means Malinki's battalion. If they would have to carry out more, again, which was not the idea, the interaction would be much more dense because it's evacuating people and putting them in new housing and enclosure, but it was not supposed to be the case. I would say from Malinki down, it mattered a lot, yes.
Michael?
How do you cope with rejection of this research and follow-up? What's the most ridiculous pushback you've gotten?
The most ridiculous pushback I got, you know, people are quite reasonable in this field. There are some people who are certain that Ben Gurion gave the order for the massacre, and nothing can convince them otherwise. I always told them, you know, if you give me a document with choice, I'll gladly write it, but I didn't find good evidence. But I'll give you an example from another case I studied of war crimes. I study also very extensively in the Japanese case. You know, one war crime which was very rare in the Israeli-Arab conflict is rape. Happened in several cases, but relatively rare. In the Japanese-Chinese conflict, it was extremely common. And there is one scholar who said that the Japanese army didn't rape in a specific war where it did in. Later was because it was cold. I think it's the most ridiculous explanation for lack of war crimes that I've ever seen. If you ask for ridiculous things, I had to mention. Questions?
So if you don't have a question, I have a good question. I think it's 1956. Israel is coordinating with Britain and France to attack Egypt. To attack Nasser, right? So the idea was that Israel would provoke Egypt, so Britain and France will attack.
Right, the canal.
Right? So if Israel, the main plan was to provoke Egypt, right? Why they need to deception plan to go to Jordan?
Because
you have to go actually west rather than east.
Because the idea was that the Egyptian army will not be prepared for defense. To catch the Egyptian army out of its skin. And it worked very well. The Egyptian army in 56 was very ill prepared, and it was very lucky for the IDF because the IDF was not that professional in 56, and it didn't fight very well too. The strategic deception in this case helped a lot. To keep them kind of, because in war, in military science, one of the most basic principles is that defense is stronger than offense. In order for an attacker to win a prepared defender who knows he's about to be attacked and he fortifies in a professional way, you need a numerical advantage of 3-1 at the minimum. And Egypt had more soldiers than Israel. So you have to surprise them, otherwise you have no chance.
With the help of Britain and France.
Yeah, but they intervened only later. Remember that they were late. What happened actually?
Just 1 week?
Yeah.
How many days? Like
2 weeks.
days?
2 weeks. 1 week, 2 weeks.
2 weeks of engagement?
2 weeks, 1 week, I believe. I don't remember if it was 1 or 2, something in between. But they were late. The Israelis were furious about it because it spoiled the plan in many ways. But keeping them unprepared, keeping them unready was a very essential part of the Israeli offensive. We know it because it's written very explicitly in the Israeli orders at the time and in also post-mortem studies of the history department of the IDF.
But if you want to provoke somebody, right?
But you want,
This is what the plan was, basically. The main mission of Israel was to provoke Egypt. So if you want to provoke them in order to fire back on you, and then...
no, it was not such a provocation. The provocation should have been near the canal. This is crucial. Remember that the Israelis parachuted inside the depth of Sinai, in the Mitle? That was to be close enough to the canal, that the British and the French will have an excuse to intervene in the canal. So the idea was not to make the Egyptian angry. The idea was to create fighting in certain areas in Sinai. And when you do it, when you parachute people, you don't want the Egyptians to be prepared and wait for you with fortifications and fire. I saw in hand there. Yeah, please.
I have I wouldn't say a question, but some kind of a wondering. And that is, I've always been, in a way, puzzled by how Israel behaves, given the following sequence of events. And that is, we have the Holocaust, we have the Nuremberg trials, we have the Deir Yassin, we have Qibya, we have Kafr Qasim, we have Qana 1, Qana 2, and yet in 2023 we still go into Jenin, go into Nablus, and I wouldn't call them massacres, but we still have heavy civilian non-combatant casualties. So at what point will the lesson be learned?
So I'll answer in the following way, because I'm a historian, I don't want to give prescriptions for current politics and certainly not prophecies. But I would give criteria from the point of view of the study of military atrocities, which is my field, of how to examine each and every of these cases. During battle, it's almost a given that civilians die. Intentionally or unintentionally, it's called collateral damage. To study that, especially in aerial bombings, but not only, you have to compare, you have to look at the strategy of the Israeli army and compare it with the strategy of other armies who are engaged in similar operations, especially the US Army, because doctrine is very similar. And I think I need to study what happened in Qana more to give an answer of what would be the results of such a study. That's why I give criteria, and I don't say the result, because what I know is from the media, not as a historian. About Qibya. Qibya is a very, very different example, because Qibya was not really collateral. Qibya was an intentional massacre, way more intentional than Kafr Qasim. The idea in Qibya was a retaliation. To retaliate, kill civilians of the enemy because the enemy killed your civilians. It's shocking to say it, but retaliations were allowed by international law, certainly before 1945. After 1945, it's a bit murky. They were outlawed completely only in 1977. And that is Qibya. Deir Yassin was a massacre of civilians, intentional massacre of civilians, but it was done during a battle. And that's why it's again different from Kafr Qasim. What's unique in Kafr Qasim from all of the other cases that I just mentioned is that in Kafr Qasim there was no fighting going on at all. So there was not even war in the area. It was killing people out of the fighting zone, which makes the war crime and the massacre way clearer to investigate and study, both from the justice or judicial or law, international law angle, and from the moral angle, in my opinion. So the Kafr Qasim verdict, I think that's his real contribution. It did not prevent other atrocities. As you say, there were atrocities in Israeli military history all along. But at least the fact that the army had put this verdict in basic military education, and every soldier, myself included, learned in basic training on manifestly illegal commands that you have to refuse, at least it prevented this kind of massacre. Taking civilians completely out of a war zone, a large group, putting them against the wall and kind of shooting people one by one. It didn't prevent other kinds of atrocities. But this kind of massacre, I think it did.
I think a problem is, and we talked about this yesterday, in 2021 they still won't use the word massacre to
Yeah,
recognize
that's an outrage. That's an outrage.
And so how can you really learn from these experiences if you can't even recognize what truly occurred? I would say the word
Well, we
massacre-
are historians. We are not government officials or politicians, so we are using the words that describe what happened, and we don't have any political calculations to defend the government.
Okay.
I think that what we are doing, that we refuse to use they apologize, but they never mentioned the word massacre. Peres, when he was in Kafr Qasim, former President Peres, said something horrible had happened here, a command with a black flag that should have been refused was given here, things like that. But they don't want to use the word massacre because they think it will create, may bring lawsuits from Hague or things like that. which in my opinion are completely stupid, and I think that you should just confess the truth.
How does a lack of political calculation give your message more power, and how does it set you behind the politicians?
You see, we all have political opinions. So, you know, we and Ahmad that speak about methodology, right, very often, historical methodology. Ahmad is more modern than I am, or more postmodern, you can choose, right? Postmodern. I believe that historians should look for the truth, and I believe that historians should try to be objective. I don't believe that we can. I think that we all have our political opinions, we have our point of view, we have our blind spots, we come from somewhere. That's why postmodernist theoreticians, I think, made a great contribution, so at least we can understand these blind spots. But I do believe that we can try to be fair. Not objective, but fair. And this requires a conscious action. You discover a fact which is against you, write it first. Kind of try to overcompensate. And I think that as historians, maybe we work for political goals or countries we love or armies we appreciate and serve in our spare time, but our main job, our main boss is the truth. Yeah.
Maximum?
How quickly did word get out?
Oh,
of
that's
the
a very
Kafr
good
Qasim?
question.
And what was did the IDF or any of the associated politicians face any repercussions for this?
So it went like that. Ben Gurion, the prime minister, tried to put a gag order on the massacre in the first 2 weeks. There were secret commissions which were studying it. And Ben Gurion in the beginning thought to just execute all the perpetrators secretly. And that's it. Then he decided to go for a public trial. In the public trial, the Malinki, the battalion commander, Dahan, the squad commander and platoon commanders offer were, I think they got 17 years in jail and demotion to the rank of private. But they were pardoned. In appeals, it was kind of cut down, and they set only a few years. I think Offer, the really most bloodthirsty murderer, was the last one to be released. Politicians didn't face any repercussions, though there was a small political crisis. Actually, it's interesting, it connects with what Amr asked before on the war of 1948. One of the commanders of 1948, who is himself responsible to expulsions and quite a few crimes, especially in the north, Moshe Carmel, was the loudest condemnator of the Kafr Qasim Massacre. And what he said is just that, I thought we are beyond 1948. We are still poisoned by this damned war. He wrote a kind of an article against Ben Gurion, and he signed very powerfully with his nom de guerre in the Jewish underground before the war, a Hebrew prisoner. So yeah, there was a political controversy, there was a crisis, but they kind of went out of it. It shaked the foundations of the military administration on the Israeli Arabs, but the military administration was not cancelled. It would be cancelled only 10 years later. About what happened in Kafr Qasim itself, this is again an outrage. The government forced the villagers to agree to what you call in Arabic a sulha. We call it at least sulha. We call it sulha in Arabic as well. A ceremony of a reconciliation with the government. And they didn't want to be there, but you cannot really say no to the government. Immediately after the massacre, the Mukhtar, the kind of the leader of Kafr Qasim, sent a message to Ben Gurion, we don't blame the government and the army, we love the government and the army, we kind of blame only the murderers. And there were all sorts of limitations of the military administrations, also on memorial ceremonies in Kafr Qasim. On the other end, the Israeli left and other liberal Israeli politicians also at the time tried to work with the villagers for the commemoration of the massacre. So it was kind of split inside the political spectrum. Yeah, Amr.
Last question, Amr.
So sort of going off of what Professor Muhammad said and also what Maximus said, do you think that, and also going off a little bit what you said before about sort of the mindset of 1948 and how that sort of bled into the Kafr Qasim Massacre, and then how now it's been bleeding into the modern day, where every year you have tens, hundreds of Palestinians that are killed in raids into the West Bank and bombings in the Gaza Strip. Do you think this mindset is still prevalent within the Israeli security complex of Israeli forces? And do you think it's still prevalent?
I don't think it's as bad as it was in 1956, certainly. I think it's a mindset of war, certainly. It's a mindset of anyone who is designated as a terrorist, falsely or rightly, is fair game. This is certainly the mindset in the IDF. But I think there is also a mindset that if you can, you should not kill civilians. And these are kind of two mindsets which are fighting one another. Anyone who is designated a terrorist is fair game, but we don't know who is a terrorist. But I think most soldiers believe also that they shouldn't kill civilians, and different soldiers behave differently in different situations. I know personally of pilots who refused order to bomb certain houses because there were children inside, or things like that. Others did bomb. It depends whom you speak with. An army is a very big group of people. Military education is also complex because you can get contradictory messages. And I think both of these messages exist. But I don't think that the idea that in 1956, remember, Frankenthal, who refused to carry out the massacre, was certain that he will be court-martialed. This didn't happen later. Just to tell you one last sentence, what happened to Frankenthal later? He became a Mossad agent, and nobody knew what happened to him afterwards.
Thank you very much. If you haven't signed you up